When a Pharisee, an expert in the Torah, asked Jesus which was the greatest commandment, he replied with twice the answer, noting not only the greatest commandment, love God, but the second greatest as well, and the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22:39. This was the perfect answer to one who was trying to trap him in a legal technicality, and to a group of legalists who prided themselves on ranking God's commands and their traditions. Jesus bypassed their detailed ledgers and told them they really only needed to be concerned with two things: loving God and loving their neighbor. By fulfilling these two commandments, they would be fulfilling all the rest. Put another way, their efforts to keep the lesser laws without keeping these two greatest laws were misspent at best and hypocritical at worst. In addition to summarizing the content of the Ten Commandments, Jesus was doing something else with his answer. He was reminding the scribes and Pharisees of the danger of mixing man's traditions with God's laws. The commandment for God's people to love their neighbors was first set forth in Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Lest God's chosen people should think this command extended only to each other, however, verse 34 adds, the stranger, resident alien, who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. So the Hebrew people were commanded by God to love Hebrew and non-Hebrew people alike. Rather than viewing the world as us and them, Hebrew and Gentile, God was requiring them to love even those who were different. The distinction between Hebrew and non-Hebrew would continue, but the treatment of non-Hebrew people in Israel's midst was to be loving, not hateful. All of those strangers among them were their neighbors, according to the Lord's perspective. By the time Jesus began his ministry, however, a strange change had occurred in the religious tradition. Leviticus 19:18 was being misquoted as, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That is the way Jesus quoted the Pharisees in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:43. This change was probably born out of the Jewish leaders' long memories of oppression. They had suffered at the hands of the Egyptians for 400 years, then been attacked by numerous border nations for several hundred more years once they settled in Canaan, then hauled into captivity by Assyria and Babylon, then oppressed by the Greeks, and finally in Jesus' day by the Romans. So they were clear about us and them. They had decided it was God's will for Jews to love Jews, but to hate everybody else. They had rewritten Leviticus 19:18 and chosen to avoid verse 34 altogether. But Jesus corrected them. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For if you love only those who love you, what reward have you? Matthew 5:44-46. Jesus made it clear. We are to love like God loves, without distinction. On another occasion, an expert in the law asked Jesus for opinion of the us versus them question. Jesus' answer resulted in the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. When Jesus asked who the real neighbor in the story was, the expert answered correctly, the one who showed mercy. Jesus said, go and do likewise. Luke 10:25-37. A neighbor is anyone who has a need that we are in a position to meet. Cultural, racial, economic, and religious dividing lines notwithstanding, our keeping of the second commandment demonstrates our commitment to the first commandment, to love God. For he says in the Bible that if you do it unto them, you've done it unto him.